workforce that would maintain that industry. Well, where do you find a workforce? In adults? No. You find a workforce in children.
CIA believes that all people are born with a spy secret superpower. For some people, that means they can build hidden, start
institutionalizing children to grow them into future workers. Well, how do you do that? By putting them into schools, by putting them into institutionalized schools that are structured and directed by the government and growing them. So you have your petri dish of growing workers. And that's where you start coming up with state tests and state standards and national tests and national standards. And you start standardizing what everybody learns, and you standardize their language, you standardize their curriculum, you standardize everything. So that when they get into a factory, guess what they are? Standardized, right? You need one manager for 50 workers. So when you have your 50 students and they're all various levels of capable, some are smart, some are not, you just standardize. You force the smart ones to slow down and you force the slow ones to try to keep up. And then at the end of the day, you call them all graduates and you put them all into a factory workforce. That was where we came from post 1950s. Well, now we live in the AI era. Right? We've had the digital revolution. We've had the information revolution. I would argue that we're getting ready to go into the age of intelligence right now. Artificial intelligence exists. Digital media exists. People are so ill prepared for the current generation, the current revolution, because we've still been factory farmed, just like our GMO lettuce or our GMO corn. Right? We've been factory farmed into this workforce of ignorance. We're just supposed to do what we're told for an employer. So as a result of that, you end up having this world where people are lost. They can't tell between good information and bad information. They don't know whether it's right or wrong to have ambition. And they believe still what they were told in the past, which is that everybody should have equal paychecks, equal size houses, equal cars, equal everything, equal access. That's not what human beings want. What human beings want on a survival level, what every single person listening wants in their heart of hearts is abundance, excess. We want to make sure that it's better to throw away old bread than it is to run out of bread. So let's keep a few extra loaves, let's keep a few extra slices, because I'd rather throw it away than run out of it. That's not going to be equality, right? As long as there's abundance, that means that there's surplus, and that surplus is something that others would argue, we would all have been trained by now to believe that surplus should be redistributed.
Imagine earning $2,000 a month, but owing $5,000 just in credit card interest. And then, out of nowhere, your bank tells you the interest rate is about to double. Well, that's pretty much what's happening to Japan, the world's third largest economy, with a debt that's now close to 250% of its GDP. We're talking about a debt to GDP ratio never before seen in a developed economy. In fact, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba hasn't minced his words. He's made it clear the country's fiscal situation is extremely concerning.
Our country's fiscal situation is undoubtedly extremely poor, worse than Greece's.
It's a statement we've never heard from a Japanese leader before, and it's echoed not just in Tokyo, but across global markets. So, is the world's third largest economy on the brink of its own Greek-style debt crisis? Well, to be fair, there are some warning signs accumulating, and they are starting to set off alarm bells. For one thing, Japan's GDP shrank by 0.7% in the first quarter. That's 3 times worse than the most pessimistic forecasts. On top of that, long-term Japanese bond yields, in other words, what it costs the government to borrow, have shot up to their highest levels in 2 decades. Why? Rising interest rates, Trump's threats, and overall, uncertainty. And of course, this all means one thing. It's now way more expensive for the Japanese state to raise finance from the markets. Just to give you an idea, demand at the latest auction of 40-year government bonds was the weakest in nearly a year, forcing the government to offer record rates of up to 3.67% per annum. And as if that weren't enough, Washington has added fuel to the fire, with threats that could turn into a wrecking ball.
Japan could lose $17 billion in car exports due to US tariffs, says UN Trade Agency.
It turns out that Japan has been one of the biggest creditors of the United States for years now, and it still is. But maybe what will really grab your attention is that the Japanese government is also a major lender to Washington. So the question is, how on earth can a country drowning in debt at home be lending money to a richer nation like the United States? The rest of the world isn't exactly stable either, so finding ways to work smarter than ever. That's where chatllm.abacus.ai documents and Gemini's feature makes AI writing sound way more human and can even bypass AI detectors. If you're into coding, there's also Code LLM, a built-in VS Code style editor for devs. And here's the star of the show, Deep Agent, an advanced AI agent that can build full websites, apps, chatbots, research reports, and more. All of this, just $10 a month. Way more affordable than juggling multiple subscriptions. Check it out at chatllm.abacus.ai or click the link in the description. Definitely worth a try. And now, back to our topic. Well, here's the thing. This is all part of a financial strategy that Japan has followed for decades, a strategy that may now be falling apart. And to really explain how this works, let me give you some facts. According to US Treasury figures from May this year, the Japanese hold about $1.13 trillion in US bonds. That's almost a quarter of Japan's own GDP, and it makes them the #1 foreign lender to the US economy, ahead of even China. And as I was saying a moment ago, the fact that Japan has become Washington's largest foreign creditor is no coincidence. It was the result of two very specific circumstances. First, a carefully planned strategy by the Bank of Japan. Since the 1980s, they've been recycling the country's current account surpluses this way. So what does this mean exactly? Well, when Japanese companies export cars or chips or whatever, they get paid in dollars. Then those exporters exchange their dollars for yen through the financial system. And here's where the Bank of Japan strategy comes in. The central bank scoops up these dollars in exchange for yen. And instead of just sitting on the cash, they invest it in safe assets, like US Treasury bonds. Basically, they buy bonds with those dollars and earn interest, knowing they'll get their money back down the line. It's a standard way to hold international reserves. It's safe and liquid. That is the first part of the scheme. The other part is about private investors. You see, until the recent inflation crisis and the spike in global interest rates, Japanese bonds paid literally zero or even negative returns. It was a lousy business. So for big Japanese insurers, pension funds, and conservative savers, a US bond paying 3 or 4% was like gold compared to the desert of returns at home. And so for decades, the mix of cheap money in Tokyo and safe US bonds made treasuries the favorite asset of Japanese savings. Up until now, this system seemed unbreakable to the point that we could simplify it somewhat as follows. You buy my debt, I buy your cars. And of course, cars means lots of other goods that feed America's trade deficit with Japan. That was the relationship until now. And if you follow visual economic, you know that with Trump back in the White House, everything can suddenly be thrown up in the air. And this brings us to Japan's internal problem. Remember how I said a moment ago that Japan is now paying more and more to finance itself? But that's not all. The value of the yen is in free fall, and it now takes more and more yen to buy a single dollar. That's fueling inflation and eating away at Japanese savings. So the key question is, how do you normally fix this kind of problem? The simplest, most direct way is to raise interest rates. The problem is that in this case, that would make it even more expensive for the Japanese government to borrow, pushing the country toward a debt crisis and probably into a deep recession at the same time. The second option to stabilize the yen would be for Tokyo to buy up yen on the market using dollars. To do that, Tokyo would need to sell off US bonds, get those dollars back, and then use them to buy back yen and strengthen its value. A solution that would hit the stability of US debt directly, and in fact, they've already started doing just that.
Japan has confirmed that it stepped into the foreign exchange market to support its currency against the dollar, reporting it bought $62.2 billion during the 5-week period between April 26th and May 29th.
For the moment, the amounts are small compared to the US bonds they hold, but this type of move sends out a warning to all concerned. If things get worse, we will be looking to US debt to save us. In other words, what we're starting to see is the real risk that one of the world's biggest debt buyers will start to falter. And if that happens, US bond yields could rise sharply, pulling European interest rates higher right along with them.
Japan's Kato says US Treasury holdings could be negotiation card.
So of course, with all this going on, here on Visual Economic, we started asking a few serious questions. How on earth did Japan end up in this situation? What went wrong in a country that, for decades, was the symbol of endless growth and success? How affect the United States? And maybe the most important question of all, will Japan's financial crisis end up reaching all of us? Well, stay tuned, because today we're going to break down one of the biggest financial time bombs of the 21st century. A crisis that might be brewing right in the heart of the land of the rising sun, and one that could even turn the world's stock markets upside down. Let's dive in.
From Abenomics to a Shiba shock.
To understand the current mess, we have to go back a few years. During the Shinzo Abe era, Between 2012 and 2020, the well-known Abenomics was implemented, a policy of massive stimulus, government spending hand over fist, interest rates at 0 or negative, and the Bank of Japan printing yen like there was no tomorrow. The result? Japan got out of deflation, yes, but in exchange for inflating a colossal debt and getting used to practically free money. For a long time, this didn't really seem like a serious problem. Japan could finance itself almost for free, thanks to the fact that most of its bonds were held by local savers, and because the Bank of Japan itself was hoovering up public debt like a kind of monetary Pac-Man. But suddenly, everything changed. By the end of 2024, the global economy rocked by post-pandemic inflation, the war in Ukraine, and rising interest rates in the US and Europe, Japan found itself caught in a real bind. Veteran leader Fumio Kishida stepped aside, making a way for Shigeru Ishiba, a politician known, somewhat ironically, as a real fiscal hawk. He came to power promising to get the country's public finances back under control. And with his arrival came what the media quickly dubbed the Ishiba shock, a brief drop in the Tokyo stock market, and expectations of a radical shift in Japan's fiscal policy. Basically, it marked the end of the free-for-all known as Abenomics. For the first time in decades, the Bank of Japan started to lift its foot off the monetary accelerator. In 2023, it scrapped negative interest rates and has been gradually raising them, now up to 0.5%. Sure, that might sound laughably low in other parts of the world, but for Japan, it's a major shift. Not only that, but the central bank has also reduced its bond purchases massively, which in itself has pushed up interest rates on government bonds. And this has had an immediate effect. It has become more and more expensive for the state to finance itself. What's more, according to the International Monetary Fund, almost a quarter of Japan's initial budget in 2025 will be spent on interest payments and debt repayments alone. In other words, a quarter of the entire public spending pie will go directly to creditors, while at the same time, spending is soaring due to another, even more serious problem. Today, 1 in 3 Japanese citizens is over 65 years old. What does this mean? Fewer workers, less consumption, less tax revenue, and at the same time, more spending on pensions, healthcare, and social assistance. In short, less income and more structural expenditure. And not only that, for decades, the country has been suffering from a plummeting birth rate, which means that there are fewer and fewer young people to support this huge and ever-increasing mountain of pensioners. Basically, Japan's tax system simply cannot cope. And of course, when you spend years plugging the gap by piling on debt, at some point, the rope starts to fray. That's not even the worst part. The real trouble begins when the economy stalls. And as we said earlier, in the first quarter it shrank by 0.7%, more than triple what even the pessimists were expecting. And naturally, with all the threats and uncertainty stirred up by Trump, it's no surprise that alarm bells are starting to ring. And still, that's not all. Check this out.
Japan inflation climbs at fastest rate in more than 2 years. High food prices pile pressure on central bank and unpopular Ishiba government.
After years of flirting with deflation, prices are now rising between 3 and 3.5% a year. We're talking about a level not seen since the 1990s. And yes, it may sound like a bit of a joke compared to what happened not so long ago in Europe or the United States, but for the Japanese, it's the biggest price increase in a generation. So what does this mean? Well, basically, Japan seems to be losing its 2 great traditional characteristics: price stability and infinite cheap credit. Now, Prime Minister Ishiba, who wants to fix this whole mess even if it costs years of sacrifices, has made his strategy clear.
Japan's Ishiba rules out tax cuts funded by debt issuance.
Ishiba doesn't want to cut taxes at the cost of piling on even more debt, and his position seems clear. With interest rates rising and debt already through the roof, issuing more bonds to lower taxes would just be throwing gasoline on the fire. That's where things stand. The Japanese government is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, if they cut taxes to try and boost the economy, the deficit could explode. But on the other hand, if they raise taxes or cut spending, that could choke off growth short term. So what's Ishiba doing? He's trying to find very targeted cuts and tax hikes that won't torpedo Japan's economic model, a model that's heavily based on exports and a capital-intensive industry. For example, he's working to phase out some subsidies and gradually raise the VAT from the current current 10% to 15% by 2027. Sure, that could help the government's revenues, but of course, hiking VAT by 50% is going to hit consumers across the board, and that could cool the economy even more in the short term. So yeah, it's like a massive Sudoku puzzle, and we'll have to see how it all plays out. What's clear is that Japan ended up here after decades of easy money and sluggish economic growth, but they've been covering up the cracks with near zero interest rates, plus their national strategy of lending money to other countries, particularly the United States. So now the big question is, what impact is all of this having on Japan's economy and on the global economy? Could this actually affect us too? Well, let's break it down.
Global Harakiri.
For many years, the economic relationship between Japan and the United States has operated as an unwritten pact, visual economic community. While the Japanese economy battled deflation with near zero interest rates and hypertrophied government spending, excess domestic savings and industrial and technology exports generated steady flows of dollars. Throughout the 2010s and early 2020s, this equilibrium functioned as a kind of stabilizer of the global financial system. On the one hand, Washington financed its huge deficits without fear of a debt market collapse, thanks in large part to partners such as Tokyo, while on the other hand, both the Bank of Japan and Japanese savers were able to obtain profitability and security by escaping the negative rates they had at home. Now, of course, it's all started to collapse. The model began to break down when, after the pandemic, the US Federal Reserve had to raise rates quickly to curb the inflation caused by the stimulus plans, a rate hike that began to punish the yen more than it should have. And as if that wasn't enough, Donald Trump's return to the White House in 2025, in general, and Liberation Day in particular, have undoubtedly complicated things further. In April, the United States announced a 25% tariff package on Japanese auto imports, a direct blow to the country's industrial heartland. In fact, Prime Minister Ishiba called the measure extremely disappointing. For a Japanese person to say something like that in public, well, trust me, inside, he's absolutely furious. It was pretty much the final straw.
We had been requesting that the US government review its unilateral tariff measures at various levels, and we are extremely disappointed and regret that such measures have been implemented nonetheless.
However, the impact for the United States could also be huge. If Japan, cornered as it tries to defend its currency, decides to sell off a significant part of its more than $1.13 trillion in US Treasury bonds, the consequences would be immediate. Treasury yields would rise. That means federal borrowing would get more expensive, and the cost of credit worldwide could spike like financial dominoes falling in slow motion. In short, Trump's plan could backfire and be very expensive. And here's the scariest part. Japan wouldn't even need to sell in bulk. Just activating its currency intervention fund to prop up the yen could already send shockwaves through US debt markets. That's right, Washington, after decades of benefiting from Japan's support and loyalty, could now face a near Shakespearean paradox, its most reliable ally in Asia turning into a source of financial instability. And the worst part, it wouldn't just hit the US, this could trigger a butterfly effect across the entire global economy. Look at this.
Japan's rising long-term debt costs ripple around the world. Sharp climb in Tokyo's bond yields has potential to push up borrowing costs elsewhere.
To start with, sovereign debt markets could find themselves in really murky waters. Very murky. And what's more, if interest rates in Japan keep rising, we could see a massive wave of capital repatriation. Japanese funds that have spent years chasing returns in European and US bonds would rush back home. We're talking about a potential capital flight that could hit hard in highly indebted countries like Italy, France, or even the UK. That would mean risk premiums shooting up and borrowing costs for these countries soaring. It remains to be seen how events unfold. Until then, the questions are for you. Do you think Japan will manage to get through this crossroads without falling into a financial abyss? Can the land of the rising sun reinvent itself? Or is it headed for a Greek-style fate, as its prime minister warns? Could this be the country that unleashes the big global debt crisis so many economists have been warning about? Let us know what you think down in the comments, and let's start a debate. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Visual Economic if you haven't already done so. Thank you so very much for watching. All the best. I'll see you next time.
Bye.